Okay, so continuing our study of Reformation church history, tonight what I want to do is sort of make a little detour. Not really a detour, I'm still going to be talking about the Reformation, but it's not going to be the first part of the Reformation per se. Of course, we've been talking about Luther and how he began the Reformation in 1517. Last week we spoke about pretty much his legacy. We spoke a little bit about his uh, successor, which is Melanchthon. And so we didn't go into a lot of detail with him, but we still discussed it a bit as to what happened after um, Luther, what happened after all the colloquies and the diets and so on and so forth. And so, what I'd like to do this week, before we get into some of the second generation reformers or some of the later first generations and then into the second generation, I'll probably discuss Ulrich Zwingli a little bit, who was also part of that first generation. But then I want to move quickly onto Calvin, because Calvin is perhaps the preeminent um, figure of the second generation of reformers. Calvin was born in 1509, and so by the time he came on the scene, Luther had been the Reformation had been going on for a good 15 years or so, and so you can see how Calvin was a second generation reformer. Of course, next week, because of Thanksgiving, we won't have a study, but then in December, I'd like to go ahead and maybe talk a little bit about Zwingli and then move on to Calvin. If not that week, then certainly the second week in December. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the spread of the Reformation, and so some of the issues that took place with that. Scandinavia was the first region that welcomed the Reformation after it had begun in Germany, which is kind of logical. Scandinavia is pretty close to Germany, north of Germany. Christian II, who was the king of Denmark, embraced the Reformation, likely for political ends, but eventually adopted the exact opposite policy. It's sort of like Constantine. You know how Constantine in the early centuries of the church, he supposedly became a Christian, but there's a lot of doubt as to whether he was truly a Christian. It seemed like he was more interested in Christianity from the political standpoint. He sort of saw the writing on the wall, the reality that Christianity was in ascendance, whereas paganism was descending, becoming more and more or less and less followed by the people. And so many historians think that Constantine was simply a good politician. And as a good politician, he embraced Christianity because he saw it as a way to consolidate his kingdom. And so Christian II apparently was the same way. You remember the beginning when I was talking about how the Reformation spread, I mentioned how some students had taken the thesis, had printed copies of it, and had sent it all throughout Germany. Well, a couple of students, Olaf and Lawrence Peterson, who were from Norway, they took the Reformation from Wittenberg. They were students at Wittenberg and carried the Reformation with them to Norway. And so here you have a couple of students who take the Reformation with them to Norway. In France, the king at the time of Luther's actions was Francis I. And he didn't really embrace the Reformation fully, but he generally maintained a positive attitude towards it. France was one of the nations, in addition to Italy, that really never became reformed. Italy is sort of like logically, for obvious reasons, since the papacy, that was the center of the papacy, and it was very staunchly Catholic. But when it comes to France, also very staunchly Catholic. And so it remained, for the most part, Catholic. In England, of course, we know the story of Henry VIII. He had taken a cudgel to the Catholic faith, so to speak, and was, or on behalf of the Catholic faith, and was embroiled in a controversy with Luther about the sacraments. Henry was a staunch Catholic, But eventually, if you know the story, of course, very famous story, Henry would break with the Catholic Church over his insistence about annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marrying Jane Seymour. Of course, eventually he also divorces Jane Seymour and marries somebody else. So, Anne Boleyn, as Ginger says. And so, you know, about obviously Henry had, I think, if I remember correctly, 5 wives. And so, again, Henry's Christianity, if you want to call it that, was a Christianity of convenience more than anything else. Uh, and even though he broke with the church, but his heart was still with Catholicism. You know, he never became really a Protestant at heart. And to this day, of course, Anglicanism, which is the Church of England, has a lot of the trappings, if you want to use that terminology, of the Catholic Church. Uh, so then a succession of kings and queens in England had varying attitudes towards the Reformed faith. Some kings and queens would come to the throne, such as Edward VI, Elizabeth. They were favorable to Protestantism, but then others would come to the throne, like Mary, Bloody Mary, for example, who were very hostile. In the case of Bloody Mary, he it is believed that under her uh, regency, there were over 200 Protestants who were burned at the stake. Her regency was not very long, so this was a pretty extensive persecution. In addition to that, there's of course the people who were imprisoned, who were deprived of their livelihood, and so on and so forth, because of their Christianity, their Protestantism. So again, it sort of wax and wane. Mary, not this Mary, one of the other Marys, Mary Tudor was one of the ones that the trumpeter of Scotland, as Knox is known, had a lot of run-ins against. He wasn't all that happy with a woman being on the throne. You know, he thought that women should not be leaders either in the church or in secular society. And because of that, he had a lot of run-ins with the queens. Whenever there was a queen on the throne in England, and of course you remember at this time Scotland and England are, well, I wouldn't say united, but they're part of the same kingdom. And so Knox was a nemesis, if you want to call it that, of the queens in England. And so he had to run for his life a number of times. That is how he ends up in Geneva at one point. And he calls Geneva the greatest theological society on earth. The Geneva Bible comes as a result of Knox's efforts. And so that's where he really becomes reformed in heart. Not that he wasn't before, but that's where he really, the thoughts of the Reformation really take hold of his mind and of his heart. Obviously, we know he returns to Scotland eventually, and so he carries with him that Reformed thought, Reformed theology, and spreads it all throughout the Church of Scotland. Speaking of Geneva, of course, there's a number of illustrious individuals who carried the torch of the Reformation there. William Farel, for example, was endowed with gifts as a preacher, and he was firmly entrenched in the canton there in the Reformed camp. He fearlessly proclaimed his beliefs, which grew from an unshaken conviction. He was instrumental in bringing Calvin to Geneva. The story goes that Calvin had come to Geneva just for the day. He was on his way back to France. But Farel told him that it was his duty to remain in Geneva and help the Reformation take strong, firm hold on that canton. And so because of Farel, Calvin ended up in Geneva. And again, touching on Calvin a little bit now, and of course we'll go more in depth with him later on. He was recognized as the greatest exegete of the Reformation, whereas Luther, and I think I mentioned it before, whereas Luther was someone who was a strong character, who was more interested in debating, in advancing the cause of the Reformation by the strength of his convictions and the strength of his character. Calvin was a much more subdued individual, a much more quiet type of individual. You could say he was more bookish. And because he was more bookish, he became the leading exegete of the Reformation. He labored for many years in the canton in Geneva. He wrote numerous books and tomes. He wrote commentaries on just about every book of the Bible, both of the Old and the New Testament. He preached hundreds, probably thousands of sermons. And so he was a very prolific writer and teacher. His magnum opus, of course, is the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which are among the most valued of all the works produced during the early Reformation years. Perhaps the best work that expounds what the meaning of the Reformation is, what the Reformation, as opposed to Catholicism, why the Reformation had to take place, how it compares to Catholicism, things of that nature. And interestingly enough, it was written as an apology to the King of France, sort of explaining what the Reformation, what the Reformed Church was all about, helping, or so Calvin hoped, to help the King of France understand what the Reformation was all about, what the Reformed Church was all about. Of course, one of the most famous of all events that took place in Geneva during the Reformation was the case of Miguel Cerverus, who was a Spaniard who wrote against the Trinity. And one thing that it's important for us to understand about this time, and I think that Tim mentioned it a little bit on Sunday, the idea of sacralism. And that is the idea of the state and the church sort of being one and the same. You would have the church as being the spiritual arm, and then you would have the state being the political arm, but they were basically the two wings of the same bird. So if, excuse me, for example, the church condemned someone as a heretic, they would then pass that condemnation, that sentence on to the magistrates, to the secular authorities, and the secular authorities will be the ones that would carry out the execution. If, for example, the individual had to be executed, or they would imprison the individual, as the case may be. And so because of that, that had a lot of problems with it. Again, as Tim mentioned, that was not the design of the church originally. As a matter of fact, on the contrary, the church and the state from the beginning were at odds with each other. And it wasn't until the 4th century, with the advent of Constantine, that began to change, and the church became more part of the state. And eventually it was almost unrecognizable. It got to the point where kings had to ask the Pope permission to do certain things. And even the Pope crowned kings. And so you can see how they became pretty much intertwined. So Servetus continues to rail against the Trinity, rails against Calvin himself personally, and against some of the other reformers. He writes a book called Errors of the Trinity in 1531, and he was warned not to come to Geneva, because if he came to Geneva, he was going to be arrested, and he was probably going to undergo trial, and if found guilty, he was going to be executed, because that was the sentence or the penalty that was executed against those who were guilty of heresy. Well, he doesn't heed the warnings. He comes to Geneva. He is arrested, of course. Immediately, he is tried, and he is found guilty of being a heretic, and he is condemned to death. During his trial, Calvin played an important role in the prosecution, but he asked the court for Servetus to be beheaded rather than burned at the stake. Unfortunately, the court would not agree with Calvin, and Servetus was burned at the stake. Why is this important? Because even to this day, Calvin's figure has been stained because of this case. Many people have found this case as distasteful, which in a way it certainly was, and they have cast aspersions on Calvin's character because of it. And so a lot of times when you see people who are combating or challenging Calvinism, this comes up sort of as a way to try to tell the individual Calvinist to say, you know, Calvin's character was terrible because look what he did to Servetus. And so obviously we can't, that's an argument that doesn't hold water for the simple reason that you can't say about a person's theology that it's good or bad simply because they took a particular action. You have to evaluate the theology on its merits and whether it is biblical or not, as opposed to whether the person who held that theology was the model of consistency necessarily. I don't think personally that this is a case that stains or otherwise denigrates Calvin's stature. What I know of Calvin, he was an individual who had a pastor's heart, definitely, and who can be looked upon as an example of what a true believer is all about. And so I don't think that has stained his his figure. And so again, in a couple of weeks, next week we're not going to have a get together since it's the night before Thanksgiving. But in a couple of weeks, hopefully, we'll take up our continuation of Reformation church history.